Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche organization for Saturday, September 16th. The transatlantic elite, so-called, has been continually shocked by not only the pace but the power of rapidly moving global events, which it believed that it once controlled. Actually, their power was only an apparent power of kind of force of arms in the aftermath of the systemic failure of the Soviet Union back in 1989 and the then still yet unrealized changes that were going on in China in the late 1980s. But since the Johannesburg BRICS meeting of this past August 22nd to 25th, a series of meetings have occurred, including last week's Schiller Institute conference, which called on the global north to accept and welcome these changes that have been occurring worldwide. We want to begin this week with Helga Sepp LaRouche's most recent webcast, in which she gave a review of this past recent period's developments.
Well, I think we are experiencing right now the very rapid formation of a completely new world economic order, whereby the majority of the nations of the world, the global south, are moving, to get rid of the remnants of colonialism and, actually have very exciting plans for the future. And the leadership of the global north, they, somehow just don't get it. They are sort of trying to go with their old schemes. Look at this foreign minister of Germany, Baerbock. She's running around the world, but she has no clue. That's the problem. So I think what we did in our conference was an effort to, put the perspective of the global south on the agenda so that people in the north can actually hear firsthand from very important spokesmen of the global south what these countries aspire and why it would be in the very best interest of the countries of Europe and the United States to cooperate with this new emerging order. So I think we had in our conference, I would encourage people to watch it yourself. But I think what was very important in the first panel was not only did we have a very high-ranking diplomat from the BRICS countries itself, we had several Americans. I think this is also very important that there are Americans who are reasonable. Naturally, Diane, Sare, who is running a very successful campaign for the Senate in New York. Then we had Scott Ritter, Ray McGovern, and several very important representatives of churches in the United States, both Catholic, but also some other denominations. So I think the first panel was very important for that reason. And naturally, the second panel was very, very interesting because you had spokesmen from Latin America, South Africa, India, who would absolutely express very clearly how the majority of the world is looking at the present processes. So please take the time to watch this. Now, the G20, basically established already that the efforts by the global north to, have the usual tactics of, getting the countries of Africa and Latin America and Asia to try to get them to condemn the, quote, Russian unprovoked aggression. Naturally, this did absolutely not function. And, there could be nothing more different than the image and the perception which is being attempted to be created by the Western media about what is going on with Russia, China, even North Korea, and the reality of it. Look at what happens in what happened at this conference in Vladivostok, which is a huge business event. And, the idea that Putin is isolated is completely ridiculous. There were a lot of delegations, large business delegations, and the perspective which was presented by Putin, if people would not be so ideologically biased, they would recognize what a tremendous potential that is. I mean, some people do, but for geopolitical, not so nice reasons. But what President Putin said, he pointed out to the vast potential of the Far East of Russia. I mean, he basically said that only 30% or so of all the Russian territory is developed from the standpoint of even recognizing where what resources are. And that given the fact that Russia has within its huge territory all the raw materials which exist or have been discovered so far on the planet, the raw material richness of Russia is gigantic, especially if you think in terms of, the next period of industrial and technological scientific development. So, Putin said this will be the priority of Russia for the 21st century. He said this plan is not a reaction to what happened, with the events from 2014 in Ukraine, meaning the Maidan coup. He said this was a plan which started 10 years ago, where the Russian government started to look at the perspective of building infrastructure in the Far East in order to, basically make access to these vast raw materials. He said, we made a little mistake by not really totally anticipating the potential, because we did not think that there would be such an incredible amount of cargo being traded in this region, which is now shaping up that it will be the case. So there will be a tremendous development. He referred to the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the Count Witte plan, which obviously was at the time interrupted by the Russian-Japanese War. But that is a plan which is absolutely back on the agenda, and a lot of countries are planning to invest big time, including China, for whom naturally the opening up of such vast resources is of vital importance. In any case, what all of this proves is that the entire effort to divide the BRICS, to say there are all these tensions, it's just not in reality true, because I think these countries are completely determined to build a new system based on equality and based on joint ventures, on win-win advantages for everybody. And I think, rather than being completely hostile to this development, I think it would be very, very high time for the Western elites to just say, the majority of the world is moving in a different direction, and let's take a positive step to cooperate. Unfortunately, nothing of that is being seen right now. It's definitely not seen from the Biden administration, and it's also not seen from the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen just made a speech in front of the European Parliament in Strasbourg, where she made one of her theatrics, which she must have studied for a very long time, how to look good. But, what she said was not so good, namely that she is now proposing to have punitive tariffs against the Chinese e-cars being sold in Europe. The Chinese already have responded that if that happens, it will open up countermeasures. So we are looking at a prospect of a trade war, which is really the worst thing to do under the present circumstances. So I can only say, we have to educate the population about the potential of building a world in which all countries work together. I mean, Europe is in a terrible condition. The German economy is in a free fall. And, we should not tolerate these policies which alienate Russia and China and the global south and the BRICS countries, but we should make steps to cooperate. So, there are some voices of reason in Germany and in the United States, but they are the minority right now, and we must have them heard better.
If you're just joining us, welcome to today's LaRouche Manhattan Project meeting. And that was Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder of the Institute, who made those remarks a few days ago. Now, in her remarks, Helga was just questioning what is going on in the minds of the once thinking transatlantic world, meaning Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, and so on. Well, President Vladimir Putin of Russia, speaking a few days ago in Vladivostok, made these remarks as to how he sees the situation. And this is a quote. Essentially, we are witnessing a new emerging model of relationships and integration, and not by Western patterns for the elite, for the chosen golden billion, but for the entirety of humanity and the entire existing and developing multipolar world. This model offers creative energy, openness, and focus on a specific outcome as a powerful competitive advantage of the Asia-Pacific region, a key factor that determines, and I am sure will determine for a long time, its global leadership in economic growth. And we'll be hearing more about this area of the world and what Vladimir Putin had to say a little bit later on in today's webcast. But exactly 40 years ago in 1983, Lyndon LaRouche, in April actually, gave a succinct explanation of the mentality of the liberal utopians, also known as the neoconservatives today. And maybe they should best be called the NATO Aquarians, against whom LaRouche had then proposed an alternate policy for peace. The video that we're about to show you is from approximately a month after President Ronald Reagan had adopted Lyndon LaRouche's defensive weapons, beam weapons policy on March 23rd, 1983. And this is LaRouche speaking in Washington, describing the nature of how mutual and assured destruction, that crazy nuclear policy that was that of Henry Kissinger and others of the time, what the actual purpose of the policy was. And I think you'll find fascinating echoes in what is actually transpiring right now in the world.
The modern warfare has depended upon the ability of nations to fight continued war in depth, to rely upon their economies, their logistical capabilities, and the capabilities of their able-bodied citizens, to defend their nations in depth, and to destroy the in-depth war-making capability and will of the adversary. Now, therefore, if you had an adversary situation in warfare, and we've always had adversary situations, we still have one, I contend, against Britain, though some people in this town ignore that, then therefore you have, in order to talk about defense of a nation, you must talk about maintaining technological progress in your economy. You must talk about maintaining high qualities of education in schools. You must talk about the quality of employment of the members of society who come out of these schools. You must talk about investment to improve technology. You require certain instruments of peace to be able to fight war. This has been documented in our military policy since the time of Niccolo Machiavelli. You build an economy. You build a republic. You build strong citizens, a strong nation. And that's how you prepare for war. And you convert the capabilities of peace into the instruments of war as you require. Therefore, what happened then back when that kook, that madman, that butcher, the butcher of Vietnam, Robert McNamara, the great pacifist, decided to introduce MAD, mutual and assured destruction. What was the genius of mutual and assured destruction? Why did the same people who opposed violently the development of the thermonuclear bomb, the Russellites, the rest of the one-worlders, why did they suddenly seize upon it and say, this is this beautiful weapon? It makes war unthinkable. Salvos of thermonuclear warheads make war unthinkable. Therefore, we can use the thermonuclear bomb to have peace. Well, yes, in a certain degree. But at the same time, they were having the war in Vietnam. So what kind of peace were they talking about? They're saying we can eliminate all wars except colonial wars to depopulate the developing sector. So what we require a military force of two types. Nations must have arsenals of thermonuclear weapons. They must be prepared to destroy each other. But war must be unthinkable. At the other extreme, we'll have colonial warfare capabilities, which is called around this town today Airland 2000. Build up is called NATO out of area deployments. Let's prepare to go down there and depopulate that Africa. Let's depopulate that Southeast Asia. Let's have a war between Pakistan and India. Let's depopulate that. Let's depopulate the Middle East. Let's depopulate a good deal of Latin America. As George Ball says, let's just depopulate Mexico. Let's halve the population of Mexico. What do you think's going on in Central America except a plan that Kissinger cooked up while he was Secretary of State? What do you think's going on in Africa except the same kind of thing? Coming out of Governor Averell Harriman, the Draper Fund, which plans the depopulation of Africa. And we want to train our soldiers to be adequately equipped to conduct that kind of war, which are called population and raw materials wars. We want to have the capability, however archaic it may be relative to technology, to destroy the Soviet Union. We want the Soviet Union to be able to destroy us. In that way, nobody can fight anymore, except us big powers who can individually go off and kill off whole smaller nations, and the other big power can't interfere. And that's what McNamara wanted. That's what Harriman and his crowd wanted. Because by introducing this factor, they said in effect that no longer can we fight general warfare, but rather we use the adversary condition under thermonuclear conditions to manipulate nations and to bring our one world utopia into being.
That was just Lyndon LaRouche from April of 1983 discussing the new physical principles of peace, about which we will hear more later. But he did discuss, of course, then the policy which we see going on right now. After all, Ukraine, Niger, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq were all depopulation wars. How do you know? Far less people there after the war than before the war. And in fact, there's nothing different from a policy standpoint. They're all situations in which there were, quote, no victories, except the purpose of depopulation was carried out. However, now these forces have gone so far off the rails, they think that they can actually eliminate Russia, or at least one faction states that they intend to do that. Now, next week at the United Nations will open, and the 193 member nations, at least most of them, will be present. It also marks a very particular anniversary, the 60th anniversary on September 20th of 1963, President John F. Kennedy proposing to the then Soviet Union, less than a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that the United States and the Soviet Union do a joint manned mission to the moon. This is a proposal that's virtually forgotten in history, but it's a very important one. It shocked the world at the time it was made. It shocked the Soviet Union at the time. It was eventually actually accepted by Nikita Khrushchev about a week before Kennedy was assassinated. And it sort of marks the kind of seismic shift in thinking that will be required to get the transatlantic world in sync with developments that they can't really stop except by trying to eliminate the planet. To discuss this idea of the new physical principles of peace, as well as what has been happening more generally throughout the not just the last week, but the last period of history. We have Harley Schlanger, and we're going to hear from him first, followed by U.S. Senate candidate Diane Sare. So, Harley, good to see you.
Hi, Dennis. Thank you for the invitation. Let me begin by talking about what we're seeing in the Western media, the typical spouting of a hysterical torrent of lies, expressions which show their underlying fears. And that fear, the biggest fear, is that their control of the unipolar order, is slipping away, or we should say it's being taken away from them by the emergence of courageous leaders in the global South. Now, what's happened in recent days, we've mentioned this, you brought it up in your introduction. You had the BRICS summit, which was a fundamental breakthrough, which is moving rapidly to consolidate more nations into a new strategic and development architecture. You had the G20 flop, where the G7 nations tried to get tougher language against Russia. They failed. They tried to get stronger language on so-called climate policy. They failed. And the motion from the BRICS continued with the majority of nations at the G20. There have been coups against the colonial regimes in what used to be called Françafrique, Niger, Gabon, and others, as a feeling of emerging strength, of solidarity against the neo policy enforced by France and the NATO countries. Now, what are some of these lies? The lies that the Russian economy is collapsing, that Russia's losing the war, that they're running out of weapons and ammunition. From day one, we were told Russia didn't have ammunition. The reality is it's NATO that's running out of ammunition and is incapable of the industrial revival that's necessary to have increased ammunition, even for ammunition of the standard battlefield warfare. There's another line coming out. China's in deep economic trouble. Their real estate sector is collapsing. This from economists who somehow missed that happening in the United States in 2008, and then missed again the next phase of collapse, 2019, 2020. Somehow they've become experts on the Chinese economy. We also hear, where is Xi Jinping? Is he missing? Why didn't he go to the G20 summit? Then you had the response to the meeting of Kim Jong-un of North Korea with Putin. Comments such as this is a deepening of relations in the new axis of evil, a duo of evil. And from the State Department and White House spokesman, this is a troubling sign. Now, meanwhile, there was a conference, the Eastern Economic Forum, that took place in Vladivostok, which included a profound speech by President Putin. And yet the media are strangely silent about what Putin said. You find nothing in the Washington Post, CNN. The New York Times took one comment from Putin where he talked about the persecution of Trump, and they said Putin is preparing to meddle again in US elections. So what was it that they missed? Well, it was a profound discussion of economics from Putin, and especially a question and answer session where he developed his conception of not just the advance of development in Eastern Siberia, Eastern Russia, but the relationship of scientific progress and technological progress and culture to economic development, to the development of a nation. And he talked about sovereignty and cooperation with neighbors, reflecting the idea of Friedrich Schiller that one can be both a patriot and a citizen of the world. So I want to read a few quotes from his speech, which you'll see why they're so profound in just a moment. So Dave, could I have the first poster? Putin was asked the question, what is Russia's future? And he said, we are the makers of our future. Scientists engage in research and development. Industrialists work in the sphere of material production, agriculture, in the industrial sector, etc. Cultural figures create images to preserve our values, which shape the inner life of every person and each citizen of Russia. All of this is taken together will certainly yield a result. This means that we will develop our own country and make it even stronger in cooperation with our partners and friends and in integration with the overwhelming majority of countries that represent most of the world population, what he's been calling the global majority. Now he continued, and let me have the second poster. He said, all of this should become embodied in our country's self-reliance, including in the areas of security and defense. But this does not mean that this country will go into self-isolation. This means that we will develop our own country and make it even stronger in cooperation with our partners and friends and in integration with the overwhelming majority of countries that represent most of the world's population. And then finally, the third poster, he said, I've already mentioned industry, science, and so on, but in doing so, we must under all circumstances preserve the soul of Russia, the soul of our multi-ethnic and multi-faith nation. This humanitarian component, along with science, education, and real production, will be the basis upon which this country will advance, while feeling and taking itself as a sovereign and fully independent state with good prospects for development. It will be this way. Now, these comments are quite profound, and in the sense you heard what Helga said about Putin talking about the development of Russia's Far East. That the program for Siberia actually goes back to the American system economist Sergei Witte at the end of the 19th, early 20th century, when he was working on the development of the Trans-Siberian Railroad to unite the Asian or Eurasian continent with European Russia. But what they discovered and what Putin talked about is there are untapped resources, vast quantities of strategic metals and raw materials, which can be developed by moving into Eastern Russia. Now, at the same time, as you just heard in talking about his economic policy, he used language very similar to that of Lyndon LaRouche when LaRouche was engaged in organizing the Strategic Defense Initiative, when he was meeting regularly in dialogue at first as a representative of the National Security Council of Ronald Reagan with Soviet officials, and then later with Russian scientists to discuss these kinds of interrelationships of a potential military policy that could eliminate the threat of nuclear war, but combine it with economic development. Now, when Putin spoke in Vladivostok, he had one sentence on talking about the development of new physical principles for weapon systems. Here's what he said. And by the way, to the extent this was reported at all, it was, is Putin building super weapons? What Putin said is Russia is working on creating weapons based on new physical principles, which, quote, will ensure the security of any country in the near-term historical perspective, unquote. Now, TASS, in covering this, said this involves the use of novel technologies and novel principles of action, including lasers, electromagnetic frequencies, and so on. But the most you can find in the Western media about this is a throwaway line. There was a veil of mystery which surrounds what Putin was talking about. Well, let's look at what LaRouche said about this question of new physical principles. And you'll see that what LaRouche said was definitely not veiled. Now, when LaRouche talked about the Strategic Defense Initiative, he talked about bringing into practice new physical principles. And what he said explicitly is relativistic beam technologies, which could be used to knock out incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's the whole idea of the SDI, to make such weapons impotent and obsolete, as President Reagan said. But Lin went further. He said, these technologies will launch a, quote, laser industrial revolution, unquote. So while the immediate application of these technologies was to eliminate the threat of nuclear war, his full conception was to develop the technologies which could eliminate the cause of war. such as economic inequality and the economic exploitation of the poorer countries by those which are more powerful militarily, to put an end to the Malthusian policies of the International Monetary Fund by making these new technologies accessible to all countries in the world. Now, this idea of LaRouche was an economic development policy to provide the basis for the poorer countries to leapfrog from where they were as subsistence economies to develop the next generation of full set economic capabilities, to enable industrialization on an advanced technology platform, is what LaRouche called it. And he said this would involve the use of particle beams, microwave beams, plasma technologies, and so on. And not just in industry, but in chemistry and medical research and so on. The goal that LaRouche had for the SDI, there were three actual goals that were part of this. The first, to develop a new strategic doctrine to replace the crazy policy of mutual and assured destruction. The sword of Damocles, which basically said, we have nuclear weapons, you have nuclear weapons. If you use them, we'll destroy you and you'll destroy us, so let's not use them. And that was the balance of terror that Kissinger and others used, as you heard in the LaRouche speech from April 1983, to describe how that kind of stalemate of nuclear mutual and assured destruction would allow the fighting of genocidal population wars against the colonial world. So by developing a new strategic doctrine, you end the mutual and assured destruction policy. But then the second goal was to launch an industrial revolution based on these new technologies derived from broad application of these new physical principles. And I think we'll find out that that's the same point that Putin was discussing. But then there's a third point that came with this, a third goal, to create a new international credit system which could fund the introduction of these technologies that are developed by using new physical principles. Now, the idea of that is what we're seeing coming into existence with the BRICS, with the New Development Bank, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the motion in the Global South toward breaking the technological apartheid which has existed in the whole post-World War II period, where countries are provided weapons that can kill, but not the technology behind them, which would enable them to leapfrog from subsistence economies to fully developed economies. And so LaRouche's agreement, his proposal between the US and the Soviet Union for cooperation in moving from MAD to what he called mutual and assured survival, from mutual and assured destruction to mutual and assured survival, involved the sharing of relativistic beam technologies to leave the era of neo-colonial, neoliberal policy and launch an industrial revolution using such things as tunable lasers and particle beams for industrial purposes, for development of metals, new alloys, chemistry, and medical technologies. And he wrote about this as early as 1977 in a pamphlet titled Sputnik of the 70s, The Science Behind the Soviets' Beam Weapon. And from 77 to 83, this was a theme for the LaRouche organization, for the LaRouche movement, for Lynn's 1980 presidential campaign. For everything we were doing, we were talking about not just the military application of these new technologies, but these broader implications to end the enforced backwardness in the global South and to create a new financial system not controlled by the City of London and Wall Street and enforced by NATO, but one of sovereign nations working together in multilateral agreements. Now, what we've seen with the BRICS and others is the realization of the first step of this policy that LaRouche proposed. Now, let me just get to the final point here. Why did this lead to the demonization of LaRouche? Why was there an effort to destroy him for putting forward these revolutionary ideas? Well, let me have the next poster, please, Dave. This includes a very significant quote from an article LaRouche wrote in, I believe it was in March of 1982, titled "Only Beam Weapons Could Bring to an End the Kissingerian Age of Mutual Thermonuclear Terror, a Proposed Modern Military Policy of the United States." And what he said is that his conception of the SDI was based on the development of these relativistic plasma beam anti-missile systems. And then he says that the opposition from leading anti-growth fanatics like Henry Kissinger, but also from many in the Democratic Party, from Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan to the leaders of the Democratic National Committee, that their opposition was to the implications of LaRouche's conception, as it implied both an escalation of NASA programs and also a NASA-like crash program in areas subsuming fusion energy research and development. In other words, a transformation of the energy basis of the physical economy, and at the same time, a move into the frontiers with space and space exploration. And he said such a commitment, if adopted by the United States, would mean an automatic end to the drift of the West toward the utopian goals of a technotronic variety of post-industrial society. In other words, precisely what the two previous national security advisors, Kissinger and Brzezinski, were pushing. That was threatened by LaRouche's idea. And we should point out that that's also what's threatened today, the unipolar order, the fantasy of people like Blinken and Ursula von der Leyen. Their great fear is that this sharing of the fruits of technological advance and scientific advance means an end to neocolonialism, an end to technological apartheid, an end to the use of Malthusian ideals to reduce population, whether it's the old ecology movement, whether it's the so-called climate change, the green revolution, which is designed to destroy nations, as we're seeing in Germany with a rapid deindustrialization. So we see exactly what LaRouche was talking about in that 1983 video you just saw, that there are weapons that are easily available to countries if they're designed to kill the population. Why do you think we're flooding Ukraine with weapons? There are two reasons. One is to destroy Russia, precisely because Putin reflects this idea, embraces, I should say, this idea of using new physical principles to transform the economies of countries, but also to reduce population. This is the most effective population reduction underway in Ukraine right now that the Malthusians could hope for. At the same time, the West is continuing the policies of sanctions, which, as the United Nations Human Rights Commission reported a couple of days ago, has put 90% of the children of Syria in danger through malnutrition, lack of medicine, and so on. And it's not just Syria. There are new sanctions. Blinken was jumping up and down with excitement about the new sanctions against Russia and Belarus and against North Korea. So the US has a commitment, and NATO has a commitment, to no development, but to the use of weapons to wipe out populations, and one of those weapons is sanctions. The good news is that the neocolonialism of the unipolar order is coming to an end. And we see that in the enthusiasm from around the world to the BRICS, to the Russian intervention into Africa with economic development, to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, and so on. Lyndon LaRouche knew that this would happen. He dedicated his life to spreading the ideas that would allow nations to develop the policies that could put an end to this colonial era. This is in our hands now, and we should use these ideas as Vladimir Putin is doing, to ensure that we move out of this era of mutual and assured destruction into a new era of mutual and assured survival based on cooperation for mutual benefit. So thank you, and I'll await your questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Harley. Now, in the past weeks, examples of the failure of the American presidency and its relationship to the world has been implicitly very much in the press. The recent visit of Kim Jong-un of North Korea to Russia brought up what Donald Trump, for example, attempted to do to engage North Korea during his presidency. The situation in which China just launched this new Mate 60 phone, defying the sanctions of the United States, which were supposed to make it impossible for that phone to be developed, has shocked the United States, and it's creating very problematic implications for the attempt to control the semiconductor market. And therefore the Taiwan policy and all the geopolitical elements of that policy. And then, of course, there's Russia, where although you have a couple of American presidential candidates, RFK Jr. and Donald Trump, who have opposed the war, they have not been effective in defunding it and stopping it. And that's the way you would do it. So what the problem is the world needs the American presidency, but there seems to be no adequate representative of the American presidential system. So there is somebody there. There is somebody that exists who does have an idea about that system. Her name is Diane Sare. She's running as an independent candidate for the United States Senate in New York. And I just want to say something about not just their campaign, but something important for people to think about. The American presidential system does not require someone who is necessarily a presidential candidate to speak on its behalf. The United States Senate in particular was an organization, institution created for precisely these instances. It deals with foreign policy, and people of great stature have once occupied that hall of Congress. And so as the United Nations is about to convene, Diane has some ideas about some things she'd like to do, both there per se, but also about what should be done by the American presidency in this circumstance. So we're happy to have her here with us, and it's now her turn to speak. Diane.
Yes, thanks very much, and I'm glad to be here. I hope I can be heard okay?
Yes, you're fine.
Great. Well, I wanted to say something about this question of scientific principle, because we get a lot of confusion and a lot of people who are rightly active in trying to prevent thermonuclear war, who don't like conflict where human beings are killed, don't like sanctions, don't like starvation. That's all good. But the question is understanding the fundamental basis of physical economy, as Lyndon LaRouche did, because you meet many people. I'm reading a book right now by a psychiatrist about the transgender question and what's being done to the children, and her assertion that certain things are hard science, but politics, economics, social areas, these are soft science. It's a little bit harder to know the truth. And that's what I disagree with. I just think that people have found it comfortable to let themselves off the hook. And the issue is your conception of man. Is mankind, is humanity a good thing or not? And if you believe that human beings are an advancement above every other species, and I think there's physical, empirical, hard science evidence to that effect, then your policy must serve the development of mankind. Meaning what? Meaning that it should be possible for there to be more and more human beings on the planet living longer with a higher standard of living than previous generations. And I think that you can consider what early forms of life looked like, how simple they were, about these so-called single-celled animals, plants that had to develop to a certain degree to be able to have life which could control its own area. That is, a jellyfish, I guess they have a little bit of ability to propel themselves, but really not much. They're sort of at the mercy of the current. But a fish, on the other hand, actually has the capacity to swim against the tide or to go where it wishes to. I think that is an advancement. That is a good thing for an amphibian to be able to develop and move out of the water onto land, meaning a greater distinction between its own body and whatever is surrounding it, the development of mammals and birds, the regulation of temperature. What you're seeing is that the forms of life become more and more complex, and their relationships to the other forms of life in the biosphere become more and more complex. And anyone who studies this, I think, becomes delighted in the goodness of the creator or the creative process. You realize that it can't possibly be arbitrary. It's not random. And then you get to the existence of human life, and you could say, well, wait a minute, look at the human body. Where's the advance? They don't run faster. They don't have more beautiful fur. Human beings don't hear better than other animals. We don't see better than other animals. Perhaps you can come up with an animal species that is better at doing everything than we are. So why is that an advancement? Well, because we have reason. We have creativity. We have the ability to imagine a future which is different than the present, and to understand a relationship about the directionality of time. And therefore, we have power over nature to transform our environment and to make our environment better. And that is not a matter of opinion, but better is defined by making it possible for human beings to live more comfortably. And I say this emphatically, not at the expense or harm to other living creatures per se, but we have the ability to cultivate life. We have the ability to improve what an ear of corn looked like, to make a better breed of cattle, to make life better for animals who don't have to suffer from rabies and things like that. In other words, the existence of man is demonstrably the crowning development of creation. And therefore, you can measure the success of your society in these terms, what LaRouche called potential relative population density. How many human beings can be comfortably sustained potentially in a given land area? And clearly, the reason it's potentially and not actively or currently is because the potential always has to be beyond where your existence currently is. So what does that mean? That means you have an empirical way of measuring whether your policies are good or bad. It is not arbitrary. If you have a policy which shortens people's lives, which increases the drug overdose rate or the suicide rate, or encourages massive obesity or other things, then that is a bad policy. If you have a policy of cramming people into apartment buildings because you've jacked up the rent so high that a couple cannot afford to live in a 1 or 2 bedroom apartment. Maybe they want to have children. They need a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom apartment, but they can't afford it. They have to share a studio with 3 other couples. Well, that's a bad policy. And I think this is really important because we have this crazy society that says if you tell someone that their opinion is wrong or their belief is wrong, well, you're simply not allowed to say that. Everyone is supposed to have the right to their opinion, and if you tell them that their opinion is wrong, you've hurt their feelings, then they probably need to go in a safe space or a safe room, and you should be reprimanded and hold your tongue. Well, that means the doom of the human race. That means the doom of our planet and our solar system, frankly, because that kind of policy will lead to mass death. So now you come to an institution like the United Nations, which was intended by Franklin Roosevelt, who unfortunately was dead by the time the World War II ended, to be a place where you could avoid war. Now it's become outmoded, as many nations say. The Security Council, the permanent nations that get to decide things that have veto power: Russia, the United States, France, Great Britain, and what am I forgetting? My goodness. The US, France, Great Britain, Russia, China. Those powers. Well, there's a whole lot of nations now in Africa, which is huge, which has 54 countries that are developing very rapidly. Shouldn't they have a voice? Shouldn't their interests be taken into account? What about Ibero-America? Similarly, nations on the move, nations getting toward their own economic development. There have to be some changes in the structure. Nonetheless, we have an opportunity coming up where the leaders of 193 or 5 or 8 nations will be represented in the coming weeks at the United Nations. Each of these heads of state or heads of government or foreign ministers will be speaking there. They also, many of them will be doing things in and around New York City, speaking at institutions, being hosted by various what we call hyphenated American gatherings, and it will give us the opportunity to intersect them. If we had any honest news media in the United States, they might cover what leaders from India or Egypt or Ethiopia or China are saying at the United Nations, and Americans would get an opportunity to realize that the rest of the world is not quite as insane as the current Biden administration or its advisors. That would be a very good thing. The Schiller Institute is cooperating again with Humanity for Peace to hold a peace rally near the United Nations on Thursday, which will involve a great deal of music, which has been called a universal language because it is. And that will be, I think, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Thursday the 21st, which is International Peace Day. And I would encourage people, if you can't come into New York, to plan other activities in your area for that. Also, in terms of activity, I can say today is the, as they call it in New York, the Steuben Day Parade. It is a celebration of the birthday, which was September 17th, 1730, of Baron von Steuben, who was born in Magdeburg, now Germany, then Prussia, who came to the United States, clearly recruited in some way by Ben Franklin, whose operations we really don't know very much about because everything of necessity had to be totally quiet and secret and not written down and so on. But somehow von Steuben was recruited in France and arrived at Valley Forge in 1778 in a very difficult time. The Americans were not winning the war. People were very demoralized. The majority of the population in the colonies did not really support the revolution. They just wanted it to calm down and go away. George Washington, Ben Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and others had very clear things to say about why this couldn't be allowed, not the least of which was what they knew the British were doing in India and other places. They knew that there would be a massive increase in the death rate not just the loss of freedom, but loss of life, if we were not successful in creating a republic on this side of the Atlantic. But not everybody shared that view. People were smaller sighted, wanted to preserve their own comfort, and the Revolutionary Army wasn't doing very well. And at Valley Forge, they actually lost 1 out of 6 men due to disease. So when von Steuben arrived, he immediately set to work cleaning up certain things about the camp, establishing systems of sanitation and health as a top priority. He said that if you're leading a group of men, that you want to earn their love and their trust, but you do that by looking out for their welfare, by making sure they're cared for when they're sick, that if they have complaints, you listen to their complaints. If they're legitimate, then you solve them, you address them. This didn't mean he was any shirker on discipline, but his presence, combined with that of George Washington and their determination, remoralized the revolutionary forces, created certain standards of order so that the entire army would understand the same commands and be able to be deployed uniformly. It was extremely important. And of course, ultimately, we did win the American Revolution. And I think his collaboration is evidence of something Americans tend not to think about, which is that our founding was a conspiracy of leaders all over the world, and not just brilliant European leaders, but leaders in Haiti who sent 500 of their top troops to help us in the Revolutionary War in a battle in Georgia. So this was a conspiracy to defeat the British Empire and to establish again a conception rooted in the sanctity of human life, man and man's existence as the top priority of your form of government, and the development of that unique capacity of human beings, which is our creative reason, as the mission of the government to protect and to create a society in which the discoveries made by the individual can be assimilated to lift the entire society to a higher level of functioning. Now the revolution is being led in other parts of the world, and the government of the United States is on the wrong side. This is what we have to immediately reverse. That's the work of the Schiller Institute, the LaRouche organization. That's the intention of my campaign. There is a much better identity of the United States. Lyndon LaRouche was perhaps the greatest embodiment of what the intention of the founding of our republic was to date, and it's that spirit that we have to evoke in every American. If our nation were to start acting that way, we would have no problem in our relations with the rest of the world. That's what I have.
Okay, well, thank you, Diane. We have now about 5 questions that we've gotten. For other people who want to ask questions, we'll put that in the bottom of the screen. You can see how to get on and do that. Before we go to questions, what we want to do is show a clip from Lyndon LaRouche from that same April 1983 speech that he gave, in which he discusses a bit on new physical principles, and specifically he makes a reference, which I'm going to ask Diane about when he concludes, concerning the relationship between, well, you'll hear about it, music and lasers.
What I'll do is limit myself here to the question of basic principles as they apply to lasers and laser-like devices, or laser-like directed beams of directed particles. There are 2 principles to know in terms of a laser, or these laser-like devices. First, if I can take a very small amount of wattage, a very small quantity of electricity or energy, and concentrate on a very small area, sufficiently small area, I can reach what is called an energy flux density sufficient that there's no matter that won't, no form of molecular matter that won't boil away. That's the first thing. Now, that's something that almost anyone can understand from the normal standard of the theory of heat. The second principle can't be explained the same way. Lasers have a property which is sometimes called self-focusing. That is, when you take the amplitude of the beam, and the beam hits the target, you find that the energy of the laser, the work done by the laser, is focused on a much smaller area than the beam would indicate. And what this means is that lasers have a property, this self-focusing property is really, in better way described, have the property of harmonic resonance. That is, going into the upper range of the visible and non-visible spectrum of electromagnetic radiation. The monochromatic or laser, coherent laser types of radiation, in one range, precise range, will work on molecules. That is, it is absorbed to the scale of molecules, and will be absorbed by molecules. On another scale, another range, the energy is absorbed on the scale of an atom. On another range of the spectrum, it'll be absorbed by the nucleus. Beyond that, it will be absorbed by subnuclear magnitudes. The thing is really very simple. It happens that when you get above gamma ray radiation, it behaves very peculiarly. Above that level of the spectrum, we call these things particles. And these particles come in ranges, different qualities of particles. They also have, and a better name for a particle is a singularity, or a better name is perhaps a wavicle, because there really are no particles. In that sense, not elementary particles. These ratios might be called Keplerian, because they have the same properties that Kepler inferred in his proof of the composition of the solar system. That is, if we construct a spiral, the logarithmic spiral that corresponds to the distribution of these wavelengths and frequencies, and draw that spiral on a cone, you'll find that on the 180 degree or 360 degree rotation, that these ranges precisely correspond to these harmonic, self-similar harmonic intervals, just like as a corrected version of Kepler's laws do. So I don't think we have the slide here, do we? No. I thought we were going to have it. We don't. Well, I'll get to that in a minute. But I'll give an example of this. You can imagine a tenor who is trained in bel canto methods. This tenor, if he has the qualities, can break a glass. But if he's trained in bel canto methods, the breath which breaks the glass will not move a candle flame in front of his mouth. It's a lasing-like effect. As a matter of fact, the bel canto method is based on the laser principle. That's how it works. And that's how these things work. What we try to do is to tune lasers or laser-like devices simply so that as they pass through the medium, which we don't want them to do anything to, such as the air, if it's a target somewhere in the air, we try to tune them through a window in the medium where they will not do any work or they will not be absorbed by the medium, but they are so tuned that when they reach the target, they will do their work on the target. Yeah. In the future, to give some idea of what we're headed for, we take some of these particle beam devices. If we can accelerate this electromagnetic radiation, which we call particles at that point, or singularities, we can accelerate that sufficiently, a workman, so to speak, a skilled workman at a bench, can routinely and, so to speak, in mass production, transmute matter. That we can achieve energy flux densities which are based on concentrating the entire energy of a beam at a point within a matter of a fraction of angstrom units. The impact of this technology on production will be far greater than the impact, and that within a few years, than the impact of the development of a heat-powered machine, of the development of chemistry, or the general use of electricity. This will be the greatest industrial revolution in all history. And there's no aspect of production, there's no definition of natural resources. There is nothing that is known today and accepted today that will remain the same within 20 years from now. This is the greatest scientific revolution in history.
All right. So actually, this is a question obviously for both of you. Harley, why don't we go for your response to that first, and then we're going to ask Diane to respond.
Well, I think the important thing that Lynn was getting at is exactly what I laid out in my presentation, which is the revolution that occurs when you have a capability to increase the energy flux density of the system. And this is precisely why we've seen the Malthusians so hysterical about not just nuclear power, but also coal, so-called fossil fuels. The idea of any efficient system threatens the other idea that they have of a static or a limit to power, limit to growth approach. And what Lynn was talking about there, you just think about some of these ideas, the ability to concentrate that amount of power in industrial processes, the idea of microwave technologies, of plasma technologies, that you can literally reduce virtually any material on the physical universe, at least on the Earth, to its constituent particles or constituent elements. And this directly takes on this idea of limits to growth, that we're running out of resources, that these advances in concentration of energy create new resources. And this is exactly what the discussion of new physical principles is all about. And that's why it's so exciting to think about this becoming the basis of the Global South's revolution, were they to internalize and fully get these ideas of LaRouche. And I think many of them are, because we see nuclear programs in places like Ghana and South Africa, the recognition that the resources they have today are useful, but more importantly is the science and technology to create new resources in the future. So this is the real revolution that Lynn introduced during the 70s and 80s. And I think it's catching on in a way that's to the detriment of the Malthusians and their financial controllers.
Diane, obviously, Lynn talked about magnetic resonance or harmonic resonance, excuse me, in the context of this, and to give an example from what appeared to be a musical example, among other things. So whether you're going to talk about that or any other thoughts you have about what he actually was saying there and the implications of it.
Well, I think this is a very exciting idea. And if we had any real science going on, and there are little pockets of it here and there, for example, the research on thermonuclear fusion raises this question, because when you're talking about tuning or you're talking about frequencies, there's also a question of resonance. There's a question of geometry. There's a question of where something vibrates in tune with something else. That is, why does the tenor or the soprano have the ability to break a glass? It's not that they go like you're blowing out birthday candles and you knock the glass over. The way it happens is there's a certain wavelength, right? A certain tuning which resonates with the tuning, the shape of that glass and the quality of the glass, which causes the glass to then vibrate in sympathy. This was famous actually for marching over a bridge. You don't want your soldiers to march exactly in a certain tempo at the same time crossing some bridges, because there is a frequency in the length of the bridge, the materials that it's constructed with, where, like the glass, you can get a resonance where the bridge will start shaking in sympathy, you say, in resonance with this frequency. this has massive implications, which we tend not to explore because we're so obsessed with things that we can see and touch. We're so obsessed with sense perception that we've chained our imagination to the rocks at the bottom, or to the scene at the back of Plato's cave, and are not considering how things may actually work. Why does something that doesn't seem to be proximate to something else or touching it nonetheless respond to a change in that other thing? And I think this is very rich if we figured out frequencies having to do with cancers or malformations of tissue, or even insects. They've done some work on it, right? Certain kinds of pest control where you're targeting certain insects with a specific frequency. It's worth considering. I mean, we look at ourselves, we think that our bodies are enclosed by our skin, we're distinct from what's around us, but how much quote unquote space exists between the nucleus of an atom and the electrons? How many millions of neutrons could you stack or pack in there? But it's not empty space. There's obviously something going on. There's obviously some kind of magnetic field. Again, frequencies or other questions. There's just so much that we don't know. And I think if people had a greater involvement and participation in classical music, where you're working with this all of the time, I think that would greatly help our scientific endeavors to figuring out much more about this, the way the universe functions, shall I put it, than we currently know. Obviously, we are advanced beyond people thousands of years ago, but really it's not moving at the pace that it should. And I think that allowing people to consider these possibilities, and the possibilities particularly of tuning. I was thinking the other day of this question of sonoluminescence, that apparently there's a kind of a curvature or bubble where a sound wave gets converted into a light wave. That's very interesting. Why? What causes that? So I think the areas of study are massive, and I think it's really tremendously, it makes me happy to consider all of the things that we don't yet know about the universe. There's so much room for the growth of the process of human discovery, and I'm hopeful with all of these space missions going on in India, China, Russia, UAE, and other countries, and this being shared with the young people, the children watching these missions, that we're going to start producing some scientists who begin to figure these things out.
Okay, so we have now 7 questions, and I think what we can do, because there's also somewhat limit that we have on our time today, give these guys these questions to you guys, and as quick as we can be in the answers. But the point is, you'll see they're all somewhat different, but let's get right to them. All right, so here's a question from Mark. There are persistent claims that the BRICS are a left hand for the globalists, one hand to cover the other. The COVID response tends to support this otherwise contrarian view. What say you? So let's go to you first, Harley.
Well, here's an irony for you. I mean, the people who have that view also say that China is a controlled asset of the World Economic Forum, and that Putin, they say, was a young representative tied to the World Economic Forum. There are all these theories out there, and what they're missing is the real story. They're missing the fact that the ability to control the direction, the dynamics of history by people such as Klaus Schwab and his followers is limited to the extent that you have an ability to make breakthroughs outside of the controlled environment. Now, one of the simple examples of this is this idea that the Chinese are somehow going to be, well, here's one of the theories, that what Kissinger opened up with China, what Nixon opened up, the China going into the World Trade Organization, was the preparation to have China replace the United States and Britain as the center of the world empire. Now, the center of the world empire, when it's Britain and the United States, is an empire based on looting not just the poorer sectors of the world, but also increasingly the home sector. Look at the situation inside Britain right now, the misery that's being imposed on the people of the United Kingdom. Look at the deindustrialization of Germany. Now, the idea that that's being done by these global billionaires who are planning on moving all of their operations to China, and the fact that some of these companies are moving to China proves that that's the case, is nonsense. Because what they're missing is that the policy of China is to develop the economies of the world, which will take them out of the hands of the corporate oligarchs who run the unipolar order. And so they're missing the big picture. And what they do is they come up with this idea that the COVID was a test run. It was run out of China. It was done to weaken the power of the populations in the West to fight against authoritarianism. Well, there's a lot that can be said about COVID, but the idea that this was somehow a Chinese plot is absurd. And I think the important point here is to go back to the principles that you heard in LaRouche's discussion, which is that the advances in science and bringing online new technologies based on scientific discovery puts more power into the hands of individuals, not of the corporate entities, but of the people. And that the evolution of our constitutional republic in the United States, even as it's been degraded by the efforts over the years of the British to undermine the American system, it's the tradition of the American system of credit, of national credit, but most importantly of development of the individual and the individual as a creative being. What do we see in the United States? We see the degradation of that, the drug legalization, the rock, sex, drug counterculture. That's something that Putin was speaking against. Putin's talk about the tradition, the cultural tradition of Russia. What are the Chinese doing? They're educating millions of scientists and engineers and classical musicians. And those are people who, as they grow up, will be fighters against the idea of an increasingly impoverished population slaving away for the globalist billionaires. So I think the premise that's behind this idea that China and the BRICS represent the shift of power from London to a new oligarchy is missing what's done. What happens when you lift 800 million people out of poverty, as they have in China? It creates an incredible, not just a market, but an incredible resource for further advance. What's happening in Africa now, where young people are clamoring for science and technology, and they want the Belt and Road Initiative. They don't want it to become slaves of China. They want it to develop their own nations. So the idea that somehow the World Economic Forum is orchestrating this, I think, is just a sign of people being desperate and looking for excuses for not coming to terms with the ideas of LaRouche and our movement, that it's in the development of science and classical culture that you create a population which has the capability to resist the real authoritarianism of this global corporate order.
Okay, yeah, what I'm going to do is this. I will be asking different questions, and if you wish to respond to the one you've heard that one of you will answer, I'll ask you, but you don't have to because we got a lot of questions. Okay, so here we go. So here's one for you, Diane. This is from Debashis D. I have no idea what that name means, but the question is, success creates comfort. How does society prevent comfort degenerating into apathy and decadence and wanting to keep helping humanity progress?
Well, I think the problem is you lose your drive to discover things you don't know. And I was thinking about the problem with Dante's Commedia, where everybody plunges in very delightedly to see what's happening in the inferno. What were the sins that people were committing? How were they punished? Adultery, flattery, etc. Then down at the bottom of hell, treason. And then purgatory, that's also kind of interesting, hard work. Maybe fewer people get through purgatory. Then when you get to the third book, Paradiso, where Dante is working on scientific experiments like the apparent size of a candle flame at various distances and things like that, everyone kind of loses interest. That's not good. And I was thinking about, in that context, Kennedy's speech when he said, we're going to the moon. We're going to land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth. Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. And then why does man climb Mount Everest, right? These questions of, again, what it really means to be human and to do the work, it's actual work of developing this creative capacity. So I do think in part being comfortable or being given your means of subsistence without having to do anything to receive them may contribute to a certain kind of laziness, but it's not really happiness. And I think all of us know the difference when you really fight to attain a goal, or you fight to make a discovery, or to have an understanding, the expression of the light bulb going off in your own mind. There's a real profound kind of happiness, which frankly can be addictive. Why did Marie and Pierre Curie, what on earth gave them the sustenance to bring in all these piles and piles and piles of dirt to try and find radioactive material? Why were they driven to do that? What was their, guiding star? What propels a great artist? And I think that's actually the natural condition of man. And I think very evil people like Bertrand Russell and others have deployed aggressively to crush that. The Tavistock Institute famously railed against the American space program, saying that this was a terrible disaster, that every man, woman, and dog is now going to want to become an engineer or a scientist. So for those the tiny elite of the oligarchical persuasion, this spark must be crushed. And perhaps it's really that, and not our relaxing when things become comfortable, but the actual deployment of evil people to snuff out that spark of genius to make people believe they are satisfied. And I think really that may be one of the things behind this massive drug legalization that is being pushed on us, not only of drugs that are illicit now, but the pharmaceuticals that are being pushed on our children and pushed on everything. I guess they figure you can chemically alter your mind so that that desire for perfection is snuffed out. I don't think it's actually a natural state of human beings, but we have to consciously fight for a society that rejoices in the ongoing perfection of our species.
Okay. Harley, you have anything to say on that?
Just very briefly, you think about this question of comfort. It reminds me of the Francis Fukuyama's End of History, because this was the original document that was behind the neocons and the unipolar order, that we've now achieved the end in history, the end of ideology. And the end of ideology is the American free market system. Well, the United States was not built by a free market system. It was built by a Hamiltonian credit system. And what was done with this idea of the end of history was to essentially adopt an outlook which basically said, we can sustain our power in the United States as long as we impose the neoliberal policies, if necessary, by military and regime change on the rest of the world. And as Diane was saying, when people buy into that kind of outlook, whether it's laziness, whether it's greed, whether it's racism, the sense that we're the chosen race or the chosen nation, that's the kind of ideology which causes people to become uncreative. And that's also why when you look at people like George W. Bush and Dick Cheney and Antony Blinken and Sullivan and others, you realize what dull minds these guys have. They're essentially like mafia bullies. And the alternative, as Diane said, is the joy of a discovery. When you see a child discover something, why shouldn't that be the outlook or the kind of response that we carry into adulthood, of seeking to find out something new and in fact finding out that we were wrong about our beliefs? So, I would just say that about this question of the end of the how does comfort fit into this? It's not really comfort. It's a deliberate destruction of the enthusiasm about a creative mind.
Okay, there's a question from Rick Adam, and he asked this. I recall that years ago, LaRouche was talking about a gold-backed system like the BRICS nations are forming now. Obviously, this was a mean to return to a society as God intended. Would you comment, please? So, Harley?
Well, in fact, what LaRouche was proposing was that we get back to a fixed exchange rate, and the quickest way to do that would have been to return to the Bretton Woods system. But what he has never been an advocate of the gold standard as the basis of an economy. What he's believed in is what he's developed is this concept of the Hamiltonian credit system, by which as you extend credit to the physically productive sector of the economy, you constantly create new wealth, which enables you not merely to cover your previous debts, but to have a surplus to invest in the future. And in that sense, what we're seeing with the BRICS, I think so far, is that they're not advocating a return to gold per se. What they're advocating is a return to physical economic production and a credit system which will enable nations to extend the credit that's needed to bring new people into the workforce, to bring online the new technologies and so on. Now, gold may play a role in that. There's no question about that, as it has in the past. But the idea that there's somehow magic to gold was never LaRouche's idea, or that there was magic to money. The magic is in the drive of human creativity to create something new and to do it in such a way that it adds to the bounty of mankind. And if you measure value that way, as he did with this idea of the potential relative population density, then you see that it's not just a system based on some connection to a metal or a fixed value, but it's based on the constant advance and development of human nature.
Okay. Diane, anything to say about that? Okay. The next question for you is from Thomas. How do we realize the full potential in every human being? Is there an educational method to do it the right way?
That's for which of us? I'll go ahead, and then Harley may have things. Okay. Well, there's certainly many wrong ways. I don't think there's any one particular right way. Again, it's the question of the directionality or where you want to be. Clearly, there's been a decision. I had an interview last night on what happened to education, and the woman who was on with me was a guidance counselor for 20 years. And I found it very interesting because she said that she thought the destruction of education began with the elimination of phonics. Well, what did the elimination of phonics do? It made sure that a lot of young people never learned how to read. If you don't have a grasp of language, your own language, let alone your own language or any others, then you're limited in what you can think. I think Humboldt was very much onto this question of language as the key to unlocking your ability to make a creative discovery. So that's something very important. But again, I think the measure is this question of potential relative population density, and Harley brought in the other element of that, which is energy flux density. And it doesn't mean a utilitarian approach where it's just drill and grill and you want your child to have the right answer and be an engineer or that they must do something. But the whole purpose of education is to develop the character of the individual, the unique character. And this is the other thing that I've always found a little bit paradoxical, because if you say, is there a right way, or how do you think of the people you can think of who clearly were geniuses, who had a quality of genius, whether it was Helen Keller, Beethoven, Leibniz, Confucius, Einstein. If you think about these people, Bach, Schubert, they are each very unique. And in fact, it seems that the more brilliant someone becomes, the more they are unique. So how can that be? And I think that gives us perhaps a glimmer of some of the possibilities of what kind of curriculum we'd like to have. But there are people who've done a lot of work on this. I mentioned Humboldt, Herbart. These are very important people. Lyndon LaRouche has written a great deal about human creativity and questions of curriculum and so on. What he stresses repeatedly as being primary is you want the child to actually work through the process of reproducing the creative insight of the discoverer. And there are some thinkers like Johannes Kepler who give you a beautiful roadmap in which to do that, because Kepler was so delightfully honest about his mistakes. It really takes you through the process of discovery so that you can have your own method of knowing whether something is right or wrong by working through what he did, the pitfalls for how he came to make his discovery. There's a short dialogue of Plato's, a Socratic dialogue, the Meno, which is perhaps an encapsulated version of this approach to discovery. But that's really what we want to unleash in young people, is for them to have the ability of determining whether something is true or not by developing a hypothesis and then constructing their own experiment to prove whether or not their hypothesis is true or is not true.
Okay, Harley, anything on that?
I think Diane expressed it very beautifully.
Okay, the next question is from Menashe, and he asks, can Elon Musk's Starlink technology be used to fuel the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine? How can we ensure the safety of humanity against the use of such technologies as tools of war? And what measures can be taken to mitigate their potential impact?
Well, let me start with that, because there was a big controversy recently because Musk acknowledged that he did not allow the Starlink technology to be used for an attack on Crimea. And on the one side, you had people saying, why not? Why would he hold back from that? And Musk himself was very honest. He said he was afraid that could trigger nuclear war. But it ignores the bigger question, which is the role of big tech in the military-industrial complex. And this is where you see what I think is the biggest problem. If you look at such things as Amazon, Jeff Bezos, the cloud, the Bezos has big contracts with the Pentagon to run their cloud computer system. You have others, Facebook, Google. Many of these companies are now part of the military-industrial complex in various areas, and the Starlink system is just one example of that. Now, if you have a tech sector, let's say, which is just looking for more control, more product placement, the obvious place to go right now is the defense sector, because this is where hundreds of billions of dollars are going. And as long as there's an impulse for war coming from the military-industrial complex, people are going to try and sell things that will fit in with that. Now, obviously, there are many uses for computer technology other than war. But the problem we have is that we have a system which orients toward the protection of these kinds of companies for purposes of protecting the unipolar order. And let me simply say that I think the other side of this, the other way to look at this, is that many of these companies that are involved in contracts with the Defense Department and so on are also the ones that are involved in censorship, in the use of hybrid warfare, so-called, to manipulate and distort reality, to pump out lies, to use social media or to control social media to keep the truth out. So there was a meeting, a closed-door session that took place in the Congress last week in the Senate. The man Diane tried to get rid of, Chuck Schumer, called for a closed-door session. Why a closed-door session? To talk about the regulation of big tech. And clearly there's an attempt to protect big tech as a corporation, which is very useful to the global corporate order, to keep them protected from real regulation. And I think this is an area that we have to take a look at, because the ability to create a situation where people hold the truth as more valuable than having the right opinion includes breaking the power of big tech. So it's not just the use of these companies for conducting military kinetic warfare, but also the psychological warfare that comes from these big tech companies.
Diane?
I had a thought, and my thought is, why aren't we building cities on Mars? I mean, really, if it's not, and I think Harley, I'm so glad he brought up because Elon Musk actually stopped Starlink from being used, as Harley said. That was extremely important. Thank goodness that he made that decision, and he had a strong enough ego and faith in his own ability to reason and know what puts us over the edge for thermonuclear war, that he did it. But really, what is something that would inspire people to make these kind of discoveries or to use technology the right way? We should be planning for a manned colony on Mars. That would require building science cities, as I know the Russians are doing, in very difficult terrain above the Arctic Circle, or what the Chinese are doing in developing pressurized rail cars to go up and down various difficult mountain ranges. The United States hasn't built a new city in decades. We have no plan to do so. And this kind of endeavor would really capture the imagination of people, young and old. And I think that's how we would ensure that technology is used for the good, is that we actually have a good mission for which we need to develop the technology.
Let me just add one point on that, because one of the things that Musk is ridiculed for is his desire for interplanetary travel, including the idea of colonizing Mars. This was something for which Lyndon LaRouche was ridiculed by the small minds of the media and the scientific community when he made it as his presidential campaign, an ad, I think it was in 1988, The Woman on Mars. So, there are a lot of things you can say about Elon Musk, but he did something right on Crimea. And I think his commitment to develop space capabilities is extremely important.
Okay, we're sort of at the conclusion at this point, and I just want to pose a final question. Given that, again, the United Nations is convening next week, we referenced, just apropos of what Harley just said, JFK's September 20th speech. And there was a question that came in from Willie Daniel. What does it mean to be human? And I think we should offer this as the last question to which you respond. And then I will will editorialize at the end about the same thing. So, Harley, why don't you start, and then we go to Diane.
Well, I think what we've been discussing is that the actual human instinct is to recognize that there's a creative capability that man alone possesses, at least as far as we know, in the universe. And that creative capability has enabled us to go from very small groups of hunters and gatherers to over 8 billion people on the planet. But it's been a rough go. I mean, there have been massacres, there have been genocides, there have been wars, destruction, the misuse of technology as a physical force to destroy other cultures. So the human impulse, nevertheless, has survived. And the question is, where do you find it? How do you make that human creativity accessible to young children today? And I think what Lynn always emphasized is through classical culture, through study of tragedy and the dramas of Aeschylus and Cervantes' Don Quixote and Shakespeare, through the tragedies written by Friedrich Schiller, who explicitly set out to use the tragic principle to inspire people to figure out solutions to what seemed to be an inevitable destiny. This idea that we can create something new is the quintessential human capability, but you find it, as I mentioned, in the classical drama. You find it in poetry. Think about how few people discuss poetry today, and part of that is the slam poetry and the whole destruction of poetry in the modern period that destroys this idea of metaphor, which is really the height of the poetic principle of discovering something new in language which does not directly flow from the words you're using, but creating new ideas. And the same thing with music. So the quintessential human activity is this process of discovery, but discovering something beautiful about your fellow man and in yourself, and how that reflects the principle of the creator in each of us. Whatever you refer to, whatever religion or view of God that you have, the godlike quality that is bestowed on man is the ability to change our destiny. And I think that's what makes us human.
Diane?
I think Harley's given an excellent answer. I was thinking this, just to slightly elaborate a point, the love of the creative potential in the other human being, including the unique ability to love someone who has done something rotten to you. That was something that Martin Luther King wrote about. It is clearly, you could say in that sense, a Christian principle, but Christian is universal, really. And it is really unique to a human being, and the ability to love people whom you have never met or will never meet, but to recognize that your own immortality is connected also to their immortality, and therefore to conduct yourself in such a way to ensure that that becomes dominant, and that mankind becomes immortal, that we don't snuff ourselves out by blunting the very part of us which is the most important, which is in the invisible domain. A human being is a human being, whether an infant who dies very young, whether someone very old who may have lost consciousness in a certain idea or knowledge. Nonetheless, we are still human. So what is that? That spark of humanity is not only our own, but it also depends on other members of the human species to ensure that it continues.
Okay. Harley, Schlanger, Diane, Sare, very good that you guys were here today. I think the discussion we had is going to give people not just a lot to think about, but a lot to do with the United Nations opening up, and with the forces around Lyndon LaRouche, Helga Zepp LaRouche, assembled to intervene. It's going to be, I think, a very eventful next 7 days. We'll be back here, of course, to report about this next week. Thank you for being with us. Now, as I said, I would say something about this question about what it means to be human. And I want to say that the way I want to approach this is to talk about, if you're an American, what it means to be human, because I think that might be the easiest. If you're an American, what it means to be human is to be able to recognize why Barack Obama is a complete jerk. That is, to be a human being in America, you have to be able to understand why Barack Obama is a complete jerk. That is, you can't take the various easy and wrong ways out. There are people that didn't like Obama for many reasons. Some people didn't like him because he was black. Some people didn't like him because he was not from America, or these other things that they all said. Or some people didn't like him because he seemed to be sort of a complete empty suit, which I will say something about. But what Barack Obama did to the presidency of the United States is the thing to concentrate on. Libya, of course, is a clear example, but some forget the occasion. I believe it was April 1st, it could have been April 2nd of 2009, when he was visiting with the Queen of England, and effectively he and Michelle bowed to the Queen. Now, yes, was there exactly a bow? Not precisely, but what you saw in that interchange is someone who had no understanding of the actual revolutionary content of the American presidency and the American system. Of course, he sort of rejected that entire way of things. People think about him often as being a liberal, but I think we've defined earlier today what liberal really is about. I think Lyndon LaRouche was very clear about it in his notion about the prosecution of population wars. And that's exactly what Obama was for. The Libya case is the clearest one. It was not merely Obama. Of course, it was an imperial adventure involving Britain, involving France, and of course, involving the United States. But what has it done? As people know, there are over 20,000 people dead right now off the coast of Libya. But it opened up slave markets in Libya. It created a situation where the country was ungovernable. In fact, essentially, the country was depopulated. It was destroyed as a nation that had had one of the higher living standards in the world. And whatever you thought about Muammar Gaddafi, the fact of the matter is that it was an actual nation state. Look at what was done differently by Obama on the occasion of his acceptance of his Nobel Peace Prize, which he got before he did anything. And he proceeded to criticize Martin Luther King in his acceptance speech for a prize he didn't even deserve. We could give a few other examples, but for example, essentially the fact that as Dick Cheney, who is sort of a cross between, people like to call Dick Cheney Darth Vader, but he wasn't. If you've ever seen the movie The Maltese Falcon, the Fat Man, Sidney Greenstreet. Cheney was sort of a cross between him and the muttering man with no name from the spaghetti westerns, Clint Eastwood's Fistful of Dollars character. Not the character, but that muttering monosyllabic killer murderer grunt. That was Dick Cheney, and that was essentially the Bush presidency. And Cheney commented often sort of favorably about the Obama presidency because he recognized the same character lurking underneath the I'm so cool exterior that Obama would exude. Every Tuesday, he'd have this thing with the kill lists, and he'd kill people every Tuesday. And this was supposed to be some exercise in something that was called presidential authority and responsibility. But the most important element of this is the expectations of the people that supported him and the expectations of the poor of America who thought that they might have some sort of champion, not merely black poor, all sorts of people. I mean, Edward Snowden talks about it. He figured that when Obama came in, that now maybe somebody was going to do something about the illegality of the surveillance state. Yeah, then the first term passes, nothing happens. Second term passes. And so Ed Snowden decides he's going to speak out. And of course, Barack Obama is one of the main people calling for the destruction of Ed Snowden and his having to be held accountable for his crimes against us. So when you see that, now the issue is, why is he like that? Why was his presidency characterized by being able to sort of sail through cool, Miles Davis kind of cool, and not be, criticized by the people that should have been that were most disappointed and should have been most after him? Well, of course, they didn't go after him. They didn't feel they could, partially because he was black. He knew that. So even when we look at things like prison reform, or things that would have cost him nothing, and further, look at him now. Where is he now? Why does no one from any of these constituencies ever really hear from him? Why has he got nothing to say, for example, in the aftermath of the attempt to at least, perhaps, even assassinate a presidential candidate yesterday, RFK Jr.? Maybe he'll have something to say about that. I don't know. But the importance of bringing him up is that the reason that he is a jerk is not personal. It has to do with the failure of the American people to face the conditions of November 22nd, 1963 and their aftermath. The true conditions for what it takes to be president of the United States. Because it takes to be president of the United States exactly what Martin Luther King expressed on April 3rd of 1968, 24 hours before he was killed, in which he gave a speech in which he declared that he knew he would be killed, or that there would be an attempt to kill him, and he was fine with that. He didn't wish to die, but he would not make a butchery of his own conscience so that he was a living dead man. We live in an America in which Barack Obama was able to make that into a style. The butchery of conscience became a style of the American presidency. We can't blame George Bush Jr. for the full degradation. Of course, we all know he didn't, and he wasn't president. Although, of course, the events of 9/11 and subsequent to that still need to be looked at in that context. But it's important to say this because the way in which the Democratic Party presently, which has essentially abolished the electoral process in the United States in its ranks, in favor of someone who is increasingly clearly intellectually incapable of doing the job. But Barack Obama sits cool. I have nothing to say about that. Of course, Joe's going to become president, and of course he will function. But this is not a partisan issue. The issue is different. The question was, what does it mean to be human? Well, if you're sitting in this country, which is in this crisis, and you don't know why Barack Obama is a jerk, that is the biggest problem that there is. That is not being human. Oh, Barack Obama, I didn't say he's not a human being. He certainly is. That's exactly why he's accountable. But who makes him accountable? Where are the citizens that make him accountable? Not by coming up with some crazy theory about Obama or whether Michelle is a man or these crazy things that so many fools of the right-wing persuasion stated at the time, much of which was racially, in fact, tinged. But it is not recognizing that at this stage in our history, the price for the presidency, the moral price, is that one has to operate from the standpoint defined by Martin Luther King in that mountaintop speech, and the standpoint that John Kennedy defined in his September 20th, 1963 speech at the United Nations when he called upon his arch enemy to go to the moon with him, with America, and to therefore throw off what would appear to be the entire sort of geopolitical game of that time. Kennedy risked stating that. And no matter what we say about his other faults, failures, foibles, vulnerabilities, or even crimes, whatever one says about that, that moment at the United Nations 60 years ago defines the moral character of the American presidency. So being human in America means facing what we have to do as a citizenry, including as we approach the 2024 electoral season, and what we have to do now to ally ourselves with those people in all these different countries of the world that will be there at the United Nations, for example, to show up with a policy that represents the true interests of the world and therefore of the United States. We invite you to join the LaRouche organization doing that by contributing, by joining it, becoming a member of LaRouche organization or a member of the Schiller Institute, and otherwise helping to spread the word about what a real American policy, which would be a human policy, should be toward both the world and this country itself. So on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to thank you all for joining us here, and we'll see you again next week.